My name is Keshet Roman, and I am a reference librarian and the head of adult programming at the Irvington Public Library in Irvington, New York. Joining us today is Chris from the Arrive Free Reading Room, and more importantly than any of us librarians, DeLaune and Michel from Book Yaya, who is going to introduce us to our guests tonight, Lee Woodruff and Kate Washington. DeLaune?
Thank you so much, Keshet. But the only thing I need to correct you on is that I am not at all one of the most important people here. It is Lee Woodruff and Kate Washington, which I'm thrilled that we all get to be together on this beautiful spring evening here in New York. And from what Kate says, a beautiful spring afternoon in California. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Kate and Lee. Lee is going to read first. It's hard on camera to know which hand is which. Lee is going to read first, and then Kate will read. And after that, they will have a discussion that you can join into with questions. And you can do that a few different ways. You can go up to the participant section, put the cursor over your name, and a box will come up more. And you click the arrow and you'll see raise hand. You can raise your hand that way and we will call on you. You can go to the chat feature and you can write in your question there. I can ask them for you if you would prefer that, or I can let them know you have a question and we will call on you. Or you can go down to reactions under the screen and you can click a little hand raising on your square. We will see that and call on you. So lots of ways to participate. Lee and Kate are incredible women and they have written incredible books. So please don't feel shy. It's about all of us talking together. I'm going to introduce Lee Woodruff.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much. The last thing I want to be is muted while I'm reading Lee's great bio. Lee Woodruff is a journalist, popular speaker, and the author of 3 best-selling books whose distinctive voice comes from the heart. Whether she's sharing wisdom about the healthcare journey and recovery or speaking candidly about life and family, she draws on her experiences to connect with the audience. Her trademark humor and down-to-earth manner has made her a popular keynote speaker nationwide. Woodruff also runs a consulting business that helps clients become more effective interview subjects and dynamic communicators during speeches and presentations. You can learn more about her customized Speaking Your Mind sessions at her website, www.leewoodruff.com. She's also the author of 2 memoirs, the first one with her husband, Bob Woodruff, In an Instant. It's her second memoir, and she also wrote a glorious novel that if you have not read yet, grab your copy at a library or a bookstore, wherever you get your books. It is a joy. So here tonight to read is Lee Woodruff. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you. You know, there was a whole thing that Oprah, when she really liked a book, she would hold it. I guess it like lap was, really like, and then by the face meant like, buy this book. So you just did a buy this book, even though it's about 9 years old. But thank you for that, DeLaune. Yeah, I bet she didn't know that about Oprah. Well, I look at this book. This is what I call my book tour book. So Kate, get ready because your books are going to look like this. And it's like an old soft shoe. And it's difficult to look at this book because this is me like 9 years ago. And I thought I was old then. And now looking at Zoom for a year, looking at myself, no one needs to do that. That's all I'm saying. I can't wait till we can get back in person. Well, Kate, as an author of a book blog, which is just people always say like, why are you doing this blog? And what's the deal with the blog? The blog is just my labor of love. And in the days when we could travel and we had torsos and legs and we could leave the home, I did a lot of flying for work. And so I would just be able to rip through books, and it's the thing I'd rather do more than anything in the world. And Kate's book, As a Galley, came across my desk And I know, DeLaune, you're lucky enough to get a lot of books in galley form and be plugged into the book world. And for me, it's just like a child's dream. But Kate's book came across for me, and it resonated in so many ways, because not only had we both gone through a caregiving journey in a place in our lives where no one expects that to happen in our 40s, she's just such a beautiful writer. And she wrote a book which is really, if you think about it, it's sort of like Bridgerton. It shouldn't work, right? Or Hamilton, right? A rap musical about Alexander Hamilton. Who's going to go to that? Not that that's what you would think of Kate's book at first, but it's memoir. It's incredibly well-researched book about where we should be socially and societally with caregivers and people taking care of everyone. And it's a really cool look back into literature and in ways in which caregivers have appeared, from Jane Austen to a reference to the Donner Party. And for those of you in San Francisco, we can talk about that later. So my short story I'm going to read, and then truly is about Kate, is I was going about my life as a writer and a bunch of other things, and my husband was injured as a journalist by a roadside bomb. My kids were 14, 12, 5, and 5. It's the last thing you expect when you're in the trenches as a mother, but none of us are exempt from it. It wasn't like felt like I didn't deserve it. I just thought that I would be doing that stuff later in life. So I wrote a book which really started as a journal to stay sane by his bedside. He was in a coma for 36 days. He was reporting in Iraq. They took half his skull off within the first hour, which really saved his life. And this writing this story was the only thing that I had control over in my entire day. And there's a lot about writing therapy and art therapy, and I'm going to start some of my questions to Kate around that. But I picked just a short piece, and it actually has to do with friendship. I talk about what sort of sustained me through tough stuff. And one of the things I realized in hindsight was that there were 4 main legs of my stool, and each of them started with F. And it was friends and family, faith, and funny. And I think for anyone who's been through a hard time, you know, there are different versions and percentages and amounts of those Fs that we all use. So I'm going to pull on the friendship one today. My friend Melanie, who appears in this, it was that friend. I don't know if when you're part of a couple with a spouse or a partner and there's another couple and you like them equally. A lot of times it's like you really like him, but she talks about the drapes too much, or she's fabulous and all he does is talk about money and how, you know, everybody owes an equal amount, $29.94 for the dinner. But when you find that couple where it all lines up, it's just perfect. And our friends Dave and Melanie were that couple. Dave was a reporter for NBC, and he died in Iraq from a deep vein thrombosis. So all of a sudden, this best friend of mine became sort of like this blood friend of mine. So here we go. It's from a chapter in Perfectly Imperfect called The Friendship Zone. When Bob was so gravely injured and our roles flip-flopped, I learned how different the tragedy of injury was from the tragedy of death. You do not have the luxury of falling apart. You must remain, in all of your waking moments, ever vigilant. There are decisions to make and doctors to talk to. There's an ever-gnawing fear that consumes you, and there are often dire predictions, which you have to fight back. There are sorrowful family members around you and information to manage, people who need to know the status, and others who must be kept at bay for fear that they will capsize you with their own grief. When Melanie, my friend, kept asking what she could do for me, it was so different from all those days when I had simply sat with her after David died. There was no sitting once Bob was injured. There was only a frantic vortex into which all normalcy was sucked. The way in which Melanie helped me was by shoring up the periphery, as I called it, taking my kids when they needed sleepovers, managing information to our mutual friends, and holding the hope for me on those days when that task seemed too heavy a load. I wish I could do more to help, she told me more than a few times. You gave up your life for me for a year. And of course, we both knew that was a misguided, if noble, emotion. Friendship should never be a quid pro quo, but I felt oddly guilty about the inequality, as if I needed to give her more to do. Sometimes all you can do is simply move forward through each new day. On the occasion of my twin daughter's kindergarten play, I'd been living in Bethesda by Bob's hospital bedside, waiting with his brothers and parents for him to emerge from his medically induced coma. I needed to fly home and enter my house for the first time since his injury. What had once been a bustling household, waiting for Dad to return from covering a story or reporting the news, was now a place I dreaded. Would it be the new site of a sick house, the home of a father and husband who was diminished somehow, crippled in the eyes of his children? The kitchen that we had just remodeled seemed shiny and new, too bright for the tenor of our now muted lives. The ones lived in the ICU, vacillating between hopefulness and despair. During my first trip away from Bob, Melanie came down to the hospital to fill my shoes, as my sister's close friends and Bob's family had done for me during the hours when I needed to step away from the bedside. With Melanie there, I knew he'd be tended to, and that he would feel the sense of a loving touch somewhere in the recesses of his coma. As I headed back down to Washington after the kindergarten play, I'd sobbed my way through the performance, thinking about how much Bob would have wanted to be there. Melanie and I crossed paths in the airport in DC. She was flying back home to her suburban New York town, and I was returning to my post at Bob's bedside. Sitting on a bench by baggage claim, we stared out at the airport traffic through the glass wall. During those moments, there was no one else in the airport, or so it felt. "Why us, Mel?" I said dejectedly. "We were just minding our business. We weren't asking for too much, were we?" She'd just finished telling me she believed Bob would be better and that he would return to reporting again, something that was difficult in the bright light of day to imagine after all the medical pronouncements and his present unresponsive condition. "I don't know why, Lee," she answered, her voice growing softer as she became contemplative. "But I have you as my friend, and that gives me the strength to get up on those mornings when I just want to roll over." There's very little in life that can equal the rich, deep connective tissue of the committed, loving relationship of a good marriage. The years logged, the family created, the memories and shared experiences, the feeling that someone loves you despite your flaws, and the parts that they'd change if they could. All of those things made me feel so completely whole married to Bob. But if I couldn't have them, if Bob were to have died in that hospital or never came back as a functioning person, I knew that I would have my children, my family, and the power of friendship of girlfriends like Mel. They would all help to pull me back out into the light eventually, and that was a mighty powerful feeling. It was much more than a consolation prize. All right now.
Well,
DeLaune, are you going to
introduce Kate? Excuse me, I am going to introduce Kate. Yes. Yeah, because everybody else can dry their eyes after hearing that. That was utterly beautiful. I'm going to take off your spotlight for a minute, Lee.
Please.
And then we will have Kate up. Thank you. Kate Washington is here with her incredible book, Already Toast. Kate Washington is an essayist and writer in Northern California and the dining critic for the Sacramento Bee. Washington's work includes creative nonfiction, essays, memoir, deeply researched long-form pieces, food writing, and restaurant reviews, including both pans and raves. I love that you have that in there. In recent years, her work has appeared in the New York Times, Avidly, Time, Literary Hub, Bitch Magazine, Bellingham Review, Brainchild, Catapult, Dame, Eater, McSweeney's, Internet Tendency, Ravishly, The Toast, Southwest the Magazine, Sunset Magazine, Yoga Journal, The Washington Post, and more. She has also written a cooking advice column, The Kitchen Witch, for Edible Communities. She has served as a contributing writer at Sacktown Magazine, the local editor for the Zagat Survey's Guide to Sacramento Restaurants, and associate food editor at Sunset Magazine. She holds a PhD in Victorian literature from Stanford University and is a member of Les Dames d'Escoffier. Will y'all please help me welcome Kate Washington, who is here with her beautiful, heartfelt memoir, Already Toast.
Thank you so much. Lee, you're a tough act to follow, but I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction to my book. This is the opening, and it explains a little bit about the title and my introduction to caregiving and where I was when I was burned out, exhausted. I'm sure many of you in the audience have had the experience of family caregiving and know how intense it can be. My own copy has not yet got all of the bits and post-it notes that Lee's has, but I'm a little bit on my way. The book's only been out for 2 weeks, so I'm really excited to be here and to talk more about caregiving, family life, women, and all of it with Lee after I read from the beginning of the book. This is a section from the beginning and then the end of the introduction, and I'll apologize in advance if my glasses have glare. So, in despair, I typed caregiver into Google, planning to follow it up with resources or support group. The first search the autofill suggested, however, was caregiver burnout. I sighed and clicked. That morning, I'd cried my way through a miserable appointment with my husband, Brad's oncologist. The news we had received had been no grimmer than any other development over the preceding 18 months of his treatment for a rare T-cell lymphoma, which had included a debilitating stem cell transplant. But on that hot July day in 2016, I was so exhausted by the caring grind that I could no longer cope. To my embarrassment, I couldn't stop weeping or even look up. I'd always tried to project competence with Brad's physicians so they would take my questions seriously. But by 10 a.m., I was already worn out. I had spent the morning packing lunches, running our kids to summer camp, loading a heavy wheelchair into the car, wheeling my frail husband across hot asphalt, and picking up a dozen new meds from the Cancer Center pharmacy, all on not enough sleep and with the knowledge that bills, laundry, and plenty else were waiting for me at home. My good caregiver mask dropped. Tears fell on the coral-colored jersey dress I'd worn to try to present myself as capable rather than a frazzled disaster. As I broke down, the oncologist chided me for not taking good enough care of myself. If I didn't, he said, how could I take care of my husband? Fragile and overextended, I heard in that question an implication that the only point of me, as a human and not coincidentally as a woman, was to care for another person. What about my own life? Didn't I deserve care in my own right? I left the office as silently as I'd sat in it, but fuming now instead of crying. The so-called self-care that the oncologist had prescribed felt like yet another task I resented, yet another obligation I had to fulfill. What I wanted was for somebody else to volunteer to care for me. Still, I dutifully went home and Googled, intending to look for resources. The top result for caregiver burnout was a quiz to determine whether the caregiver taking it was burned out. I took it. At the end, I got the breezy result, "You're already toast," illustrated with a stock photo of a burned piece of bread. The website recommended taking more time for myself, getting a massage or going on walks, arranging for care so I could have an hour to myself, or even an occasional night away. But it said nothing about what to do if I was already doing those things and was burned out anyway. At first, I wasn't particularly bothered by the quiz's cheerful assertion that I was already toast. Toast is the food of invalids and the food of comfort. The food I turn to when I am sick, when I am sad, when someone I love is either of those things. Cut into strips, soaked in butter, unchallenging, warm, browned, delicious thanks to the Maillard reaction. Why is it also a negative word? Why, you're toast? Toasting usually makes things better. Burning makes them worse. But this quiz result was clearly negative. You're done. Crisped, eaten, chewed up, swallowed. It sounded about right. I spent more than 2 years as Brad's primary caregiver during the long, intense crisis phase of his illness. In the years since, as he's endured disability and chronic illness, my responsibilities have ebbed and flowed depending on his health. During the long crisis, I was so overwhelmed and eventually so burned out that sometimes I fantasized about simply turning around while driving to the pharmacy or the grocery store, heading to the airport instead and buying a ticket on any plane going somewhere semi-tropical. I was 42 when Brad was diagnosed, and I joked to friends that I was having a very inconvenient midlife crisis. But under the dark humor lay a lot of truth. What stopped me from abandoning my life was the thought of the fallout. Likely endangering my husband's life, shocking our friends, further traumatizing our already fragile children, inducing lifelong guilt by becoming a person who left her husband at his lowest point, alienating everyone I've ever loved, everyone who has ever loved me. I stayed. Brad is no longer desperately ill, but he was permanently disabled by the after effects of his treatment. We've worked hard, often painfully, to rebuild our marriage and our lives. It's still a work in progress. In the long ordeal of his illness, his survival was the focus. If cancer is often described as a battle, a metaphor I dislike since it's hardly a fair fight, I feel like my life was collateral damage. My book is the story of the toll that caregiving can take and of how heavily the weight of caregiving can fall, especially on women. Our culture undervalues caring and exploits those who care for others, shunting these tasks disproportionately onto women, people of color, and other marginalized groups, often paying them no more than minimum wage for their efforts. And society often frames family caregiving as both priceless and worthless, as Evelyn Nakano-Glenn puts it in her 2010 book, Forced to Care. In other words, sentimentalized narratives around caregiving may tell us the work we do is an invaluable gift that is its own reward, as in the very title of a recent book, Priceless Caregiving, Stories of Elder Care Success, Courage, and Strength. Yet the work of most family caregivers receives little financial support and so lacks economic worth. Most family caregivers are never paid, and indeed most take a profound financial hit due to a lack of societal support or of adequate work leave for their role. In truth, however, the work we do has extraordinary economic and social value. Rethinking caring labor in all of its forms and compensating that labor adequately is a major issue for contemporary feminism and social justice, one that the coronavirus pandemic has laid particularly bare. My book seeks to bring to light the often hidden phenomenon of caregiving, its invisibility, how American healthcare takes it for granted, how both sexism and racism can drive the assumptions we make about it, how quickly caregivers can burn out, and how urgently we need to change those patterns if we are to build a compassionate, truly caring society that both patients and caregivers deserve. Nearly everyone has seen the fallout of the crisis in caregiving. The plight of an elderly neighbor or relative who lives far from children or grandchildren, the friend who must declare bankruptcy after catastrophic medical treatment, even waiting lists for expensive daycare slots for kids, all illustrate how thoroughly our society has ignored those who need care. In some ways, the crisis in caregiving for the ill or disabled is an unintended consequence of the success of medical treatment, which has extended the lives of people who in generations past might have died. Brad barely survived a relatively new treatment for aggressive lymphoma. 50 years ago, the disease might have killed him before it was ever diagnosed. He deserves better support than what I, his harried wife, could provide. And like all caregivers, I deserved a life of my own. For me, care work hardly felt like a vocation with implications of spiritual purpose and a deep internal longing. Instead, it evoked feelings of obligation. I suspect that's a feeling many women can identify with, whether because they've been married, a daughter to demanding parents, or a mother. I also worried that I was revealing a deep selfishness because I wasn't intrinsically drawn to the work of caregiving. Caregiving led me to a much clearer understanding of gender politics and invisible labor, not just in my marriage, but in my own mind. Arguments about caregiving bump up continually against an impasse. Sick, chronically ill, and disabled people have a right to the care they need to live. Their lives have unquestionable value. The lives and work of we who care for them have value too. But the urgent needs of our charges win out over our own wishes, which can always be deferred to another day, another time. The result is an invisible army of us pressed unwittingly into a kind of service many of us couldn't fully imagine before it crashed into our lives like a sour incarnation of the Kool-Aid Man. For caregivers, the crisis doesn't stop when the immediate threat to life for the ill person ends. The acute emergency of severe, life-threatening illness such as cancer, powerful, expansive, devastating, all-consuming, adrenaline-fueled, is the hurricane. Caregiving is cleaning up after the news crews have left, scrubbing the hidden black mold years later, becoming ill from contaminated floodwaters. Over the years of Brad's illness, I squeezed in all of the recommended self-care I could, exercise, therapy, occasional time away, but it wasn't enough to stem the ongoing emotional, physical, and logistical demands of the situation. By a couple of years in, I was collateral damage. I was already toast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful, powerful reading, Kate. I'm thrilled that we get to hear the two of y'all talk about your experiences together. So I'm going to monitor questions. If anyone wants to join the conversation and speak to Kate or Lee and with a question, please do participate.
Yeah, we will really hope people will ask questions. And I mean, that Kate, that reading, that selection, that encapsulates everything. So the book is you, the book is all of us who will face caregiving. And it's not, well, the majority of caregivers, at least in this country, are women. There are men that are caregiving as well, of course. But let's start with three things I'm jealous of. One, your bookshelf, and I recognize an English literature book that I might have read in college, off to the left, everybody. Two, the fact that you are, a food critic, so you get to go out to eat and write about it. Let's talk about that for a minute.
I've been on hiatus for about a year because of dining restrictions, but yes, that has been my longtime work. I'm a freelance and contract writer, so that's been kind of my main work. And I was a writer, but long before I was a caregiver. So I was interested to hear you say that, you wrote and blogged through the injury, because that was kind of the genesis of my book as well.
Well, then you just took my first question. So you go with that. Let us know when did you start writing? Was there one moment where you just said, I have to get my laptop or a paper and pen? Talk about that.
Well, I mean, as you know, there's a lot of downtime at hospitals and waiting, always waiting for the doctors to come on rounds, and they inevitably come right after you decided you couldn't wait 1 second longer for a cup of coffee and stepped out for 2 seconds. But there was a lot of bedside waiting. So I would bring a computer. I've been in a writing workshop for a long time, so that was online. So I stayed in that, and I often was just writing almost rants or diary entry kind of stuff, just recording what was happening especially during my husband's stem cell transplant. He was hospitalized for 4.5 months after that and was really, really ill. So it was a long ordeal and very taxing. My children were 10 and 6 at that time. And so I would write bedside, but we also kept a blog to keep people informed about his condition, because as you, and I'm sure many in the audience also know, it's a really taxing element of caring for somebody, that you need to keep people informed. Family and friends, of course, want to know, and they have a right to know. And if you multiply that out to the texts and calls that you would get from everybody, it's a lot of restating the medical changes and what's happening, and it can be very emotionally draining as well as just time consuming. So we kept a blog about his status, his progress and prognosis through the worst of his stem cell transplant. So I was writing for that, and that was often kind of curated and shaped for the audience of family and friends. And then there was the more let it all hang out writing for myself and for my writing workshop. And those two threads came together eventually in the book, along with a strand of research that I used to buttress my own story and try to talk a little bit about the broader story of caregiving in America, which is, systemically radically undersupported, and that puts a huge burden on the 53 million Americans who are currently unpaid family caregivers for friends or family.
And I just want to say, a word about that. A lot of times people will say, oh, I don't want to read a memoir about something like that. It's sad. And, I went through some cancer or something with my dad. And I have to say, as someone, who wrote a book about our journey, and as someone who gets a lot of galleys, there's a tendency for writers to talk about so I get a lot of books, either self-published or otherwise, of people who've been through traumatic brain injury. And the typical memoir, it's so easy to just go through the litany from the beginning, pre-injury, injury happens, and then hear all the things that happen in the hospital. And I I really need to think about it someday, but what makes to me a super compelling memoir with a journey like that is not just going through time dimensionally and this happened and then this happened. And you have this amazing ability in this book to braid yours and Brad's experiences, your very sometimes undistilled thoughts of just wanting to run. And I think any caregiver who says they never felt that, even as a dream, even as just like, I'm just not even going to go back with my Ben and Jerry's, I'm just going to drive to California right now, is lying. And then the second braid is the research you did on caregiving, which is well done and not eat your peas at all. And then the third piece is this wonderful grounding in the literature and knowing you're a PhD Victorian literature. It puts a lot in perspective. But all of these three things, guys, create this three-dimensional story, which just keeps you turning pages.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's really kind. But as I say, I really wanted to broaden it out, tell a bigger story than just my story. One of the reasons was that I was conscious that, I have been a relatively privileged caregiver. I had family help. We had resources to rely on and fall back on. And so I certainly I wanted to talk about the ways in which it was hard and draining despite that, but I also didn't want it to simply be a poor me narrative. And one of the things that was interesting for me about the literary and cultural representations was that I was looking back at books that I had loved for decades, like Jane Eyre or Middlemarch, classics that were long time favorites. And I really returned to them when Brad was at his most ill as comfort reads, and including children's literature as well, Little Women, the Anne of Green Gables series, things that I'd loved, all my life or close to it. And I didn't go back to them looking to get insights on caregiving. I went back to them looking to have a read that would sustain me at a hard time. And what I started noticing was that there were these caregiver figures in the shadows that I'd never really thought about and never really noticed as a reader over the years when I was enjoying and rereading those books. And I felt it was so interesting that those figures were there all along. And for me, it really functioned as a metaphor of how caregiving operates more generally in society, is that it's something that's often taking place behind closed doors. People are going through hard times, making tough choices, and it's largely invisible to the broader society, but it's an incredibly common experience, as you know, and you start to see it once you're in it. And you talked about this occurring to you at a phase of life when you didn't expect it, and that was very much the same for me.
Well, and I know, DeLaune, I'm going to pause so you can do this question, but I don't want to forget too, and guys, don't let me forget that part of the conversation that Kate and I wanted to have is how COVID has really highlighted so many of this for people who didn't have this as an issue before, but so everybody in that sense is a caregiver in some way in their own home, but we can get to that in a sec.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I would love to also, when y'all speak about that, Kate, I would love to hear how your view of your memoir changed once, as Lee said, so many more people in America took on that role than possibly when you were writing your book. From Diana Hurwitz, Kate, what were your legs of the stool that Lee spoke about? What helped support you through this difficult process, or who helped you?
Oh, that's a great question, and I definitely want to give credit where it's due for that. We were fortunate in a lot of ways. My husband, he's had to take a retirement from work, but he was a professor at Sacramento State University. I live here in Sacramento. And so he had, I want to say, first of all, that he had good insurance and benefits, which were critical in our journey. But for me, more personally, as I said, my kids were young. The thing that I think about maybe almost the most is a couple that we had not known that well prior to Brad's illness, but who offered their younger daughter was the same age as our younger daughter. And they just said, look, no arguments, bring Lucy over every Sunday at 9 a.m. and we will take her all day Sunday, every week until he's better. So for more than a year, we dropped her off every Sunday. And it was like the kind of help that I wish I could, hand to everybody in this kind of thing. So friends, communities of other parents, our family, my husband's family is in Canada, in Ottawa, and his parents came and moved in with us and were an invaluable support for him and for me. So that was an amazing support. I couldn't have done it without all of those things. And I think a lot about how challenging it is for the people who don't have that. I will also say that therapy was a huge leg of the stool, being able to stay in some therapy and get that mental health support, because it is so draining and challenging. And having professional assistance, we also were able to find support groups for our daughters, like an art therapy support group for them, because there was a period of several weeks or a few months when they couldn't see their dad because he was in isolation unit. And that was really hard for them at their age. So there were so many different supports that were really critical.
Lee, are you okay if I bring in Jessica's question, since it speaks to, thank you, from Jessica Schwartz, being harried conjures up not enough time for yourself, but what about your experience with anxiety, which I feel like you started to speak to, Kate? Was it debilitating? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it's so anxiety provoking to have somebody you love going through a very serious illness. And in Brad's case, we had inklings about his diagnosis before we got an official diagnosis. So there was a long period of anxiety and uncertainty that kind of ramped things up. And then he had long periods where, honestly, there were several weeks where it was really touch and go whether he would live or die. And I'm sure Lee could speak to this as well. Just the simple anxiety of having that uncertainty around the life of your partner is devastating. So I did, use support, was able to get some medication help for anxiety. Also the anxiety of keeping on top of everything around the house and keeping all the balls in the air and making sure that kids, were getting to school on time, and all of the things that go into running a household. Before Brad got sick, I hadn't thought about how to manage all of that alongside a crisis. I think that's one of the things that's really hard about family caregiving, is if you could stop everything else and simply focus on the caregiving for the person you love, it would still be incredibly hard. But with everything else going on alongside, it's really challenging to keep the balls in the air. And one of the things that really often falls by the wayside for a lot of people, and did for me, is work and professional life. There are statistics about how many people have to reduce hours or leave work entirely. And I, as a freelance writer, I had the freedom to simply not take assignments, and did that for a long time, and try to protect what I could of our home life and, some extra time for myself. But it was not easy. Lee, I don't know, do you want to speak a little bit to that as well?
Yeah, I sort of dropped out of the workforce for a good year. And like you, I had always had sort of a flex work, and I had a client I'd had for 12 years that for a long time in Bob's journalism career was paying the bills, because, he was making nothing. And I had to step away from that, which was sort of a heartbreak. But I feel like this is a great place, because I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say that I read a statistic recently that, I don't know, 20-something% of the women that have dropped out of the workforce, it was because of that very reason. And, thankfully not because their husbands were in a life or death situation, but just having to let that string go so that they could do all of the other strings that you've just described that work when we have those societal pillars to support us, daycare, someone to come in and take care of dad, And I just find that a stunning, and there are lots of stats on how much women in the workplace will be set back, and the gains that we're hoping to make around the board table and in the CEO office have just been really set back by COVID. So maybe this is a good place to talk about the ways in which your story aligns with the story of so many women over this past year of the pandemic. And maybe there are folks in the audience who have similar stories to share.
Yeah, I think, that has been one of the real hallmarks of the pandemic period. Some people have dubbed it, the she session, because so many women are having to drop out of the workforce because of care responsibilities. And I think the broad narrative of that has been around childcare, which is a very much a parallel and interlinked issue with caregiving. But there are millions of women who are sandwiched caregivers who are, working to get care for their for elderly relatives during this time. I think we've seen that a lot with the difficulties of getting people vaccinated. That's often fallen on, the younger generation to set that up for parents. The pandemic is a really interesting case, I think, around caregiving, because it's really highlighted the degree to which we all need care and those social supports and the kinds of not just medical caregiving and tasks, but human contact and love and care, at the same time as it's kind of taken that away from so many people. The isolation of the pandemic has made it really challenging. And in terms of medical family caregiving, I think COVID has really shown the degree to which everybody needs an advocate in a hospital or medical setting. And it's really robbed a lot of people of the ability to have that because of the restrictions on, who can accompany people. So to me, it's just really highlighted a lot of the cracks in our systems of care.
Well said. And Lee, if you don't mind, I'll jump in with a question from Merle, which is also speaks to what y'all are discussing. From Merle Keitel: my research as a psychologist who studies resilience of and stressors experienced by caregivers, I often hear that medical professionals say things that feel unsupportive or not helpful. What was it that would have been helpful for you to hear as a caregiver? And maybe both of y'all could speak to that. That's a great question.
Merle, I love you, Merle. Where were you 15 years ago, my friend? I love that research is, sorry, Kate, I'm going to jump on this because I want to just give Merle a hug. I think that I'm fascinated by research on the caregivers, because caregivers have post-traumatic stress. Do not call my house after 9 o'clock at night. I'll be on the ceiling. And of course, that's has been overlooked, and I love that people are studying it. I know that there are a lot of things going on in med school with empathy and how to talk to people as a human being and how to deliver news. And I think we still need a lot of work on that. I don't know what gave me the ability to do this, maybe just being older than the 20-something young wives that were in Bethesda Naval Hospital in the military. But I decided I didn't want to hear the prognosis. So I told everybody I did not want to hear what traumatic brain injury was. I was not going on Google. That until Bob woke up and we saw his baseline, I did not want to go to bed every night with every possible worst case scenario. And I was amazed at the things that were said. Mrs. Woodruff, your husband's on the knife's edge. Do you understand he'll probably never be able to speak on the phone again? And I found those things, I understood them. What I wanted was for somebody to be able to talk to me in a way that left the door open for hope. And what I found, and what I say when I speak at medical conventions or other places, is that the doctors need to watch what the nurses do. And the nurses know how to tell a story. So the doctor would come in and be like, non-responsive. Like Kate said, it was always when I was like in the bathroom, right? Oh, you missed the doctor again. And they said he was non-responsive. So, until he's waking up on his own, too bad. And the nurses would come in and say, you know what? We had somebody in here just like him. And guess what he's doing now? He's reading a book to his grandchild. So you just, buck up there. And I thought, you didn't tell me he was going to be okay. You didn't give me a percentage. You told me a story that allowed me to hope that that could be my husband. And I think if we could learn to be better storytellers, we could parse hope in a better way. Kate, I don't know if you had that. I realized like Bob was in this weird place where they needed him to wake up, and I didn't want anyone to rush to judgment. You had this kind of slow burn, as you said, this creeping, like something's wrong. Oh, we think it might be. Now it is.
Yeah. And then we had long periods of uncertainty later as he was going through a stem cell transplant. I really think your idea about, we need storytellers and people who can kind of situate the patient in a narrative and include the caregiver in that narrative is really critical. And I would also say that for me, what I needed was a recognition that Brad was like a full person with a social and familial context around him, and that I was a part of that context, and that I also had that context, that I wasn't simply there as a device to help him survive. I was there as the mother of our children, as in my case, the keeper of our home, as the person who might have dropped a lot of other responsibilities, and who also often, the doctors were there having another day at the office and I was having the worst day of my life. And I think there's often a failure to recognize that I think it's great, Lee, that you pointed to the nurses, because I think in my experience, frequently the nurses did see and appreciate that context in a way that the doctors who were busy and who were focused on kind of the science of and the medical details of Brad's case were not as focused on the human context around those medical details. And I think of it sometimes in terms of STEM education. Our STEM education has really outstripped our care education and our humanities and human education. And maybe we need to pour a little bit more focus back into care and the human connections to kind of see how to keep pace on a human level with all of the amazing advances that medical science has made. I think on a broader systemic level, more funding for social workers, more funding for counselors in the hospital, more outreach to patients and families around those things would all go a hugely long way to easing this for caregivers and families.
And I want to make sure I'm not slamming doctors, because I had a number of really empathetic and wonderful doctors. And I had really wonderful conversations with my doctors, because I was, an old Nurse Ratched type gal in the hospital. I would say, okay, what, look what you just said. Are you using the knife's edge? And I remember one day when they kept using the same damn lines over and over again. It's a marathon, not a sprint. My work that day to keep my brain busy was to write them new analogies for what they could say to patients for brain injuries. They did not quite not know what to do with me, but I would also say to them, you gotta say that better to me. Like you just ruined my day. I will remember that for the rest of my life. And they would sort of laugh a little bit. But I also know that when I said to one of the doctors whom I'm still friends with today, we both are, how do you do this every day? How do you walk back in the door to your beautiful family? And three of these young guys, these Marines, didn't make it. And he said, we do have to leave it at the door at times. There are probably moments we do seem cold and unattached, and that's not because we don't care. But if we did this every day and brought it home every day, we would never get up in the morning. And I have to respect that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also should say, the physicians saved Brad's life, and they're amazing, wonderful, devoted, compassionate physicians. And I think there are big systemic pressures around time and what insurance covers and all kinds of things that are probably beyond the scope of what we're discussing here that also contribute to, a real over-reliance by the medical system on caregivers that puts a real strain on families.
And very interesting question from Barbara Smith to y'all, both of you. As a mom of palliative care doctor, I wonder if you had any dealings with palliative care. They know how to tell stories.
I did with my dad. And aren't you a lucky mom? Boy, I think the people that choose to go into this and the hospice workers and the hospice nurses, that is just God's work. You don't even have to believe in God to say that. But I can't say enough about that work. And I think as we look more at life and are able to talk about death as a part of life, hopefully not at the ages that Brad and Bob were at that unnatural part, but when my dad was, 80 something with Alzheimer's, oh my gosh, those people were incredible. And instead of fighting death, it was about teaching all of us around the bedside how to accept it. And my dad had a beautiful death because of palliative care doctor. So thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, that's really wonderful to hear, and I'm really glad that palliative care as a specialty seems to be growing in recognition. Obviously, Brad survived his ordeal, but there were these moments when it was really touch and go, and we actually did end up being in contact with a wonderful palliative care doctor who was on the oncology service at his big hospital, and who happened to be the dad of a friend of my older daughter. And so he started like looking in on and checking on Brad. And it was when Nathan, started kind of coming around. He would come around and just talk with Brad. Brad is a poet. And so they would talk about poetry and read a little bit of poetry together. And like when he had breaks, so Brad wasn't an official patient, but though the service did provide certain things for him through palliative care, but that actually really helped us navigate what was a very baffling and overwhelming system. And so the contact with the warmth and kind of human touch of palliative care was important in our journey, even though we didn't end up, using them for end of life situation, thankfully. But I think, yeah, I would love to see more specialties take the same kind of approach that palliative care takes to the whole patient.
So Kate, when did you know you had a book? When did you say to yourself, oh my gosh, these scribblings and these rantings, I've got something that I think maybe other people could learn from or be helpful?
Gosh, I think, it was in the year or so after Brad was released from the hospital after his stem cell transplant. I had been looking for a book like the one I ended up writing and not finding it, and started to have the vision of something that integrated all these different strands that we were talking about before. And I was able to take a few days while he was still quite ill, thanks to my mother-in-law, and go by myself to write something, and ended up writing like 12 hours a day. And it was then in the year or so after the worst of his illness that I really started pulling it together. But it took several more years to shape a proposal and place the book, and then finally write it for real. So as you know, it's a long process.
Jorge has three wonderful questions that it would be great if both of y'all would address. How did people do this in the past? Is this a first world problem? And what solutions do y'all recommend? He didn't say.
I'm going to let Kate do that because this is all her research and also the Victorian era caregivers.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the past and in the Victorian era, care was very much done at home. For many years, there were no hospitals, or hospitals were places of last resort. It's an interesting and challenging question, I think, in part because the medical system and what it could do for people was so different. Often care in extreme illness, situations of extreme illness, was end of life care, and there, which often, obviously, it also still is, but there are more people, I think, living with high medical needs and with high medical needs at home, perhaps, than in the past, which is not at all to discount the hard work of caregivers of yore, because it was, a physically incredibly grueling job. I've also done some research on food and caregiving, and the kinds old recipe books from the 19th century all have sections on like the care and feeding of invalids. So they have kind of a general medical manual. And I think there were more multi-generational households to provide a kind of community support, but I don't want to paint a rosy picture of caregiving in the past. I think that caregiving has always been hard, and it will never be particularly, a walk in the park. It's going to be difficult to care for and worry about the people you love the most, no matter what. But I do think that broad systemic solutions could go a long way to easing some of the solvable aspects of caregiving. Some of the strains that we could amend would really include things like the financial challenges and difficulties just of dealing with paperwork and insurance. If there were more guaranteed insurance, more, perhaps universal health care, which I know is controversial, but I think could go a long way toward making sure that people aren't falling between the cracks of care. And that would be, in the end, a benefit for caregivers. In America, we lack paid leave, and we're the only rich nation that lacks paid family leave. And if people had the option of taking time off work with pay to care for their families, they could experience less stress potentially. I think there are other policy solutions that people could look at. And then I've also been seeing a lot of businesses springing up to fill this gap in particularly caregiver education. We haven't really talked about that, but a lot of caregivers are thrown in the deep end doing pretty high-level medical tasks with pretty minimal training, and can be very, very overwhelmed by that. And so outreach, education, proactive steps to prepare people for caregiving, especially as the baby boomers age into needing elder care. Just the demographic facts are that we are going to have a care crisis, and that millions more of us need to be prepared to care for somebody in our lives. So addressing this on kind of a broad societal level, as well as community care networks, informal help among different people would go a long way as well.
What a beautiful vision for us to search for, work towards, help our society have, ours and the world. Thank you so much, Kate, for that beautiful answer, and Lee, for what you contributed with your personal story. It's rare that we have an evening where the conversation and the work is of this level of empathetic and personal nature, plus this kind of research with things that can really help us as a society. So this feels very, very special. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute, because I know that you want to applaud Kate and Lee for their beautiful evening. Yes, I am holding up these books right backwards. Okay.
Kate, you're
so
great.
much. And I'm turning everything over to Chris Shoemaker from the Rye Reading Room, who helped make this possible.
Thank you, Chris.
Say good night.
Good to see you, Lee, and a wonderful discussion as always, and nice to hear from you for the first time, Kate. It is such a pleasure to be able to present these author talks on behalf of the library, and thank you so much, DeLaune and Book Yaya, for facilitating all the connections. We have more events coming up. You can find the schedule online at libraryauthortalks.org and learn the details of the awesome work that Book Yaya is doing at bookyaya.com. The next event is on April 13th. The Scarsdale, Dobbs Ferry, and Hendrick Hudson libraries will be presenting Julie Metz and Danielle Tresoni. So I hope you'll sign up and join us for that presentation. And just again, a big round of applause to our two amazing talents. and to our facilitator tonight. Thank you all so much.
Good night, Lee. Good night, Kate.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you for a great program.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank y'all. Good night.